Start recording. Okay. Good. So I'll do another welcome. Hi everyone. Hopefully you've had a kind of nice relaxed morning getting here. I've been up for 3.5 hours or so already now, so I'm feeling very virtuous. I've just had a quick flick through a set of notes, and I think I've got some pages missing in mine. In which case we may have to send you the file, and you can, if some people have got some pages missing. But what we're going to do this morning, I think just before Christmas, we focused on the birth of Jesus. In the sessions before, if you remember, we thought a little bit about how the Gospels have come together, and how they come together. The reason why it's a little bit one of those sessions where you think, well, it's a bit dull, it's a bit boring to have done those. Well, hopefully you didn't, but it's not necessarily where we're getting to now gets more exciting, if I can put it that way. But to be able to do what we're doing now, we have to understand the agendas of why the Gospels are written the way they are. Because if you've ever, otherwise people kind of try and piece them together, and it gets quite confusing. And unfortunately, it's not difficult if you go on the internet to find kind of atheist sites pointing out contradictions all over the place. And the trouble is, they're not really contradictions, but even for someone who wants to believe, they can look like it. And that's just the nature of people telling the same story, but with slightly different perspectives and agendas in terms of how they want to tell a story. And so some of what we're going to start piecing together actually makes better history than if they matched easily. And they don't always match easily, but when you do see how they fit together, I'll give you an example of how the history works. This isn't particularly controversial, but it kind of highlights the sort of thing that starts to emerge. So in John's Gospel, when Jesus feeds the 5,000, he refers... actually not in John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, when he introduces Philip, he tells us that Philip comes from Bethesda. The feeding of the 5,000 appears in all four Gospels, slightly different ways. In Luke's Gospel, we have a little bit of a story where Jesus turns to Philip and says, "Where can we get food for everybody?" Remember? Well, if you put all of the four Gospels together, you work out, because it doesn't actually tell you where the feeding of the 5,000 happens exactly, but if you look at the flow of events around it, you can see it happens on a hillside just outside Bethesda, which just so happens to be where Philip lives, which is why Jesus asks Philip, "Where do we get food?" Do you see? So when you put the bits together, they don't naturally look like... They haven't been constructed. That wasn't put together deliberately by the Gospel writers. It's different Gospel writers with different agendas taught to record different things. But when we put them together, you can see actually they make good history. That's a good story. If we had them all exactly the same, because there are parts of Matthew and Mark that are the same. But if you remember, as we told the story, the reason they look the same is because they've come out of the same process. As the early church is meeting in Jerusalem, and they've agreed what it is, the stories that they're going to say, these are the core stories, because there are so many stories around, we need to say these are the core stories. And Matthew's done the writing down, the official version, but Peter then goes off to Rome with Mark, and he preaches from the same set of material. And a lot of the stuff that Matthew's written was Peter's way of preaching it, which is why it's so similar. But now in that slightly different context, a different author writes it down for a different audience, and there's lots of bits that are almost the same, but not quite. But Luke is slightly different, John is slightly different again. So we're going to see these bits fitting together. So there's the first couple of slides that I've got. If I, hang on, I've got to go to here. Sorry, on my screen, there we go. Is just kind of a listing of events. So you can see these are some of you will want to use this again for your study. I just want to explain what it is. We won't spend too long on it now, but I've kind of colour-coded a list of events, and when an event appears in two Gospels, I've coloured it in green. When it appears in the three, what they call the synoptic Gospels, those are the three that were written from that kind of core Jerusalem teaching. I've highlighted, so when it's in all three of them, I've highlighted it in blue. When it appears in John's Gospel as well, I've highlighted it in red. And by doing that, we can kind of get a rough flow of the events of Jesus' life. We can fit them all together. Does that make sense? And so, in particular, John's Gospel is important to fit in. Because if you remember, the tradition of the early church is it's written at the period where a couple of the apostles are now dead. Paul is gone. Peter is dead. Andrew seems to be leading the team now, and they're praying about writing of another gospel to kind of fill in, if you like, the story. And it's decided that John should write it on their behalf, and they all authenticate it. Remember, we looked at all of those things. But what John has therefore done is he kind of puts key festival framework in place. He tells us about the feasts because the other Gospels haven't bothered. And the problem is, by not bothering, it's difficult to work out how long Jesus' ministry takes. I can be a little bit kind of foolish about it, but if you take Mark's Gospel, it runs so fast, it only talks about 7 days. There are only 7 particular days in Mark's Gospel, but of course it didn't happen on 7 days. It's just he's kind of told us event. He's not actually kind of helped us get the spacing. Does that make sense? So John's Gospel helps us get the spacing from the beginning to the end. So we kind of use that as a framework. We try and fit the others in, and we kind of piece them together. And that's what we're going to kind of do today. And so you'll have an overview of the flow of events, and you'll see that there are very distinct seasons where different things are going on for Jesus. But often we miss it. Because what happens is we get told the stories as a single story. But when we see them all flow together, you actually see there's a kind of crescendos, and then there's falling away of people, and then there's more periods of more intense opposition. There are times where Jesus has to physically move location because he can't stay in the area it is because it's just got too much. We'll see all of that this morning. So the second of these kind of lists here is we've taken John's Gospel and highlighted events from John's Gospel that are also in the Synoptic Gospel. So the kind of the main text is things. This is how John's Gospel kind of lays out, and where I put it in red, we find a connection with the Synoptic Gospels. And so with those two kind of frameworks, you're able to kind of work out the flow and see how they fit together. If you do this for yourself, you'll come across things and think, this is odd. And I might refer to them because there'll be things that seem to be near the end of Luke's Gospel that are near the beginning of Matthew's. And actually, in our understanding of who the people are, it makes sense. Because it's not that they're actually the same event, but it is the same teaching. Because Phil does this all the time, I'm sure. Is you regularly have the same stories, but you have different groups of people. And actually, Luke puts it in the position where Jesus is just commissioning and sending out the 72. And Matthew puts it at the time where Jesus is commissioning and sending out the 12. See? Same agenda, therefore same teaching, but if you remember, Luke is seen by the early church as being a member of the 72. So from his point of view, that's where I want to put this incident. It's not an incident, it tends to be a teaching. Does that making sense? So you can see how the things work. So let's kind of keep going. There's some markers as we go through the Gospels that will allow us to kind of touch into seasons of the year. Once we got through this, it will start to flow a bit. I just want to explain So I put here a list of the markers or historical markers, if you ever want to kind of mark these in your Bible. For instance, we know that John the Baptist's ministry starts in the 15th year of Tiberius. So that allows us to put a marker in history, so we know what the date is roughly. We're going to see how the date's going to fit together. Right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, there's a reference to the temple being built for 46 years, which again gives us a marker, because the temple, Herod started a restoration. He'd kind of repaired the temple for the first 18 months to 2 years. Then he'd started building the outer courts. So it's probably the 46 years is to that new building works. It's the 46 years. There's a reference in John's Gospel to being 4 months to harvest, and that's not some sort of kind of kind of idiom. It's not because it doesn't make sense. And actually, there's more than 6 months between planting and harvest. So it's not means we've just planted, now it's harvesting. When Jesus says there's 4 months to harvest, he means there are 4 months to harvest, which means we can actually put a date on that statement. There's a strange reference, which most of our English translations you can't see, but because they'll say on the Sunday or something. But in Luke, it refers rather weirdly to something called the second first Sabbath. So his disciples are plucking grain on the second first Sabbath. And while we can't be 100% sure, because it's a little bit ambiguous, I think 90% sure we can go with what we're told by the early church. That's a reference to, which we'll come to when we do, which is in the Feast of Unleavened Bread is counted with 7 Sabbaths after the first second, it's called, isn't it? So on the second first year, you count the Sabbaths after the second day of just the second day after Pentecost. So if the first Sabbath was on the first day, you don't count that one. You only count them from the second. So what they tell us is that's a reference. So when it says the first Sabbath, it's basically a week and a bit after Pentecost. So you can mark that. We read about the Passover feast, so we know when those dates are. We read about the Feast of the Tabernacles in John, the Feast of Dedication, and then the crucifixion happens in a year when the official day of preparation, according to the temple, is on a Friday. So all of those markers we can build together, and we can slot Jesus' story. And this might seem like it's an obvious thing, but kind of academic scholarly opinion has shifted really over the years. Now almost universally, modern kind of academic thinking puts Jesus' ministry from 28 to 33. That's a bit longer than most think. And it's kind of noticing all of these things and pushing them into the process. So we're going to look at that window. Starting in 28 BC in a very low-key way, and there's a longer period of low-key activity that goes on than we realise. It's there in the Gospels, but because it's only kind of alluded to, there's a period when Jesus is not travelling with his disciples, but he is ministering in Galilee, for instance. It's referred to by Luke. We get these little hints that Jesus kind of, like a lot of people do, starts in a low-key way. Things only start to explode at the point where he gathers his team and starts to travel together, if you see what I mean. So from about 28 to about 33, Jesus is kind of publicly ministering, and we'll look at the story in that kind of context. So putting it together, Jesus probably is, he probably actually joins John, and this is where it's a little bit fuzzy. John comes in 28, Jesus, I put baptized 29, but it might be the end of 28. By the time Jesus comes to John, there are already crowds there, so it's not right at the beginning of John's ministry. So it's a little bit of one of these, when did he start, and so on. But around, say, beginning of 29 AD, Jesus gets baptized. He clears the temple of the money changers in 30 AD. He's not yet done anything up in Galilee yet, just to note. But that happens in 30 AD. He's ministering in that low-key way around Judea, Samaria, and then up in Galilee. And then in 31 AD, he's back in Galilee, and that's where we really think of the events that we tend to know well, and we tend to think of Jesus' ministry starting, where he goes and reconnects with people he's already done stuff with and says, come and follow me. So which is why you get that kind of difference. In John's Gospel, we hear about Jesus' first meeting with Peter, which is down in the south with John the Baptist, whereas in the Synoptic Gospels, he suddenly appears out of the blue, as if Peter's never met him before, and says, leave your boats and come with me. We're going on a trip. If you saw him. But can you see how the two fit together? So we often think that... So I can remember at primary school, because I went to a Church of England primary school, being told, given the example of, and Jesus called the disciples, and they just left everything and went. And it's a really nice, challenging story. But it's not true. They already knew him. They had already seen miracles. The difference was, instead of kind of doing a little bit of, sometimes I'm in this synagogue, sometimes in this, now we're going to tour around, and we're going for a kind of it's kind of like being on the road now. And it's the beginning of the big thing. Passover 32 AD is a real turning point. Peter confesses faith in Jesus the Messiah, and there's the transfiguration. And shortly after this, Jesus actually relocates from Galilee and goes and focuses and bases his ministry down nearer Jerusalem. It's not in Jerusalem, but it's down in the south. And there's and interestingly, I say interestingly, that is mentioned by all four Gospels, but I'm amazed that I didn't see it for years and years. That after the appearance in because it's a one-liner. Jesus left and went to Judea, and then of course we don't know what these place names are, and we don't. So in our mind, it all just blurs into one thing, and it all happens in Galilee. But actually, half of Jesus' ministry is in Galilee, and half of it is down in Judea. And so Jesus is now predominantly outside of Galilee, although he does pop back from time to time, and he's got a team now of 72 people when he's down in the south. And it's during that period that Lazarus gets raised, which is probably at the start of 33 AD. That causes so much trouble around Jerusalem. If you remember, they want to kill Lazarus as well. So Jesus has to relocate to kind of the midway point. So he's been right up in the north in Galilee. He's gone right down to the south in Jerusalem. After he raises Lazarus, he kind of moves to Ephraim and around Jericho, which is about halfway between the two. And he bases himself there. And he starts the final journey towards Jerusalem around the beginning of March. And we've got quite a lot of information from there, because that's presumably a period that Luke was a real good eyewitness to. He's part of the 72, he's there, and so he's recorded loads of stuff, but we don't really get anything in that period from Mark or Matthew, because they've focused on the seminal stuff, i.e. the beginning of Jesus, what he got going at the start. Luke kind of fills in a lot of the details here. He arrives in Bethany on the 28th of March. Jesus is crucified on the 3rd of April, 33 AD, and is raised on the 5th. So that's the overview. So we can all go home now. We'll tell the story. We'll see how it fits together. So it starts with this overlap with John the Baptist's ministry. If you remember, we see the significance in Luke's narrative of John the Baptist, and we hear about it from Josephus. But if you just took Matthew and Mark, it hardly seems that important, apart from the fact Jesus gets baptized by him. But we get an impression from John's gospel that is important, because lots of people being there, and we hear a bit more of John's preaching. But actually we know that there is at a certain level, John's ministry seemed bigger than Jesus's to those who saw it. But that's part of the context, because the people who saw it were Jews, and John is presented in the Bible as being the fulfillment, the culmination of the Old Testament. Now, Jesus is the fulfillment of it, but he's the culmination of it. And he causes a massive stir within Judea and within the Jewish community. Whereas Jesus has this kind of, it's more like a flash bang for them. And it's kind of, what happened there? But then this slow process starts that actually, of course, has covered the world. Does that make sense? So there's slightly different nature of the two ministries. One is kind of seems substantial in its day and in its time and in its context. And so from the rabbis, as they write about John and Josephus and others, see this a very significant and important ministry. When we read it in the Gospels, it doesn't seem so important. We put the two together to understand one had its context, and the other had a kind of a slower, longer-term agenda, if I can put it that way, even though it had an incredible bang. And it empowered people in a brand new way, which allowed them to carry the message further. And the reason I'm saying that is because one of the things we miss is that in tiny little touches as you read through the Gospels, you realise that actually Jesus spent longer with John than we realised. And for different reasons, we've not had it spelt out to us because they haven't wanted to confuse the two ministries. If you think of Jesus' first message, it is John's message. Repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The first thing we said, Jesus comes out into Galilee and is preaching, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's a borrowed sermon, if I can put it that way. And I don't want to diminish, but actually Jesus in his humanity grows like all of us. So anyone who's done a public preaching, probably your first ever sermon was borrowed. It was kind of from you, but it was one that you remember somebody else giving once, and you thought, yeah, I've got some takes on it. Do you know this sort of thing? And so there is a kind of a sense in which Jesus does that, and you'll see it a little bit. So for instance, Jesus is referred to while under John's ministry as being a rabbi. He's called rabbi, which implies he has some sort of teaching responsibility. John's disciples say of Jesus as his ministry starts to grow to John, the one that used to be with you. Now they're his disciples. They don't say him who used to be with us and he used to sit and they actually talk to Jesus as if he was more important to John than they are, but he wasn't the same as John. Mm-hmm. The one who was with you implies he was kind of your second, your number two. Does that make sense? And there is a kind of a period from 28 before Jesus starts doing anything in 30 AD, And so we tend in our heads, we've seen Jesus appear for baptism, he gets baptized, he immediately gets up, goes into the wilderness, comes out of the wilderness, says, come on guys, up to wedding at Cana, and bang, it all goes. Actually, we're talking about more of a year period, if not longer, that Jesus comes down and gets baptized. If we're putting the dates together, if anyone's trying to do these things, you remember if Jesus is born, as we looked at Christmas time, in 6 AD, and the reference that we get from Luke of him starting doing stuff when he was about 30 is in the context of John the Baptist. So if John started in 28, the reference can be to about 28. Actually, it means Jesus is 32, 33 at that point. Okay, so because sometimes it worries people, he doesn't necessarily start touring Galilee till he's more like 33, 34. People say, oh, is that nearly 30? But you see how that long period actually means that probably Jesus is he comes down, he is there in the crowd. He gets baptized by John. He's been with John. John perhaps they've even realised, you're my cousin. We haven't met for years, but you are. And he comes for baptism. And John's saying, you really don't need baptism because baptism is about washing. Because I know you. You're a good guy. And but he doesn't recognise until he comes up out of the water and sees the Holy Spirit come on. Actually, he's the guy I've been preparing for. And so John says, I didn't recognise him at first because he's been with him for a while. See. But at that point, presumably then Jesus steps now into some level of kind of, because John isn't doing this all on his own, in the same way that when Jesus is ministering, he has people around him, he needs people around him. Jesus steps into that kind of a role, he's in that mix. So at some period, having been out in the wilderness perhaps, or maybe, in fact it would have been after he's been in the wilderness and praying and fasting, he's still in that process, he has some level of authority within John the Baptist ministry, and John sees him and says to one of his disciples, I saw the Holy Spirit coming on him. Behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. And they can say, Rabbi, talk to us. Tell us about this. You see that? So so Jesus has kind of grown up in Nazareth, which is up here, near the major town there. It's called Sepphoris. We'll come to that later in Jesus' story. I think I've touched on it already, but and maybe we did when we did the Christmas thing. Herod Antipas, who's not Herod the Great who tried to kill Jesus, if you remember, Herod Antipas, who is his son, now governs this kind of pinkish area up here around Galilee, and he also governs this pinkish area down here. So after his dad died, his kingdom was broken up into these different zones. And Herod Antipas controls Galilee, and he controls this area called Crewe. And he decided to kind of ingratiate himself. He would build a new capital for Galilee. And in around 3 BC, he started work rebuilding Sepphoris, which had been destroyed by the Romans previously, to become the capital. It's 3 miles north of Nazareth, and which means that when Joseph went back to work there as a building carpenter, if you remember, rather than kind of making nice little models, he's involved in the construction industry in that sense. He has actually got he has this huge building project just up the road from him. It's kind of God's provision. So Jesus would have worked, and Sepphoris is the city set on a hill. From anywhere around the Lake of Galilee here, you could look up and you could see the lights of Sepphoris. So it kind of sat there looking down over the Galilean kind of valley. So that's where Jesus has grown up, and he moves down to where John is, which a lot of the Bibles will say Bethany, because most of the later translations, most of the later manuscripts of the Bible say Bethany. And you'll look, if you get your maps, you'll find in the back, you'll see there's a Bethany where Martha and Mary lived, right near Jerusalem, and you'll normally see right by the Jordan something that says Bethany on it, but nobody really knows where that is. And so it's called Bethany beyond the Jordan, but no one's quite sure where it is, but they stick it on the map anyway because people want to know where it is. But in the oldest manuscripts, it's called Bethabara, which you still see in some translations. There's no kind of contradiction in that. Sometimes the name gets replaced. You know, if I write a history of the United Kingdom, I will refer to Colchester, even though the Romans called it something different. So, I mean, the Romans kind of set up a camp in whatever. I'm not going to call it, because is it Illyricum or something like that? Yeah. But we refer to it by what's kind of common, so it's just simply probably a replacement, the oldest kind of form. But what's interesting, therefore, is Bethabara we can actually identify, strangely. The older name we can actually put some identity to. So I've marked it just down here. It's right where the Jordan runs into the Dead Sea. So this is where Jesus joins John the Baptist. Here's a kind of photo of it now. The reason we can actually locate it is because a mosaic was uncovered, and you probably can't read that, but you might be able to on your just about on your notes. It actually says Bethabara, and we know that this is the Dead Sea. You know how we know it's the Dead Sea? Because the fish on this mosaic are all swimming down the river here, so we know the river's flowing that way. And when they get to the top here, they all turn around and try and swim back the other way. So you can just about see that. So we know that that's the Dead Sea, because obviously if they get into the Dead Sea, they will die. So it's a kind of it's a first century kind of visual joke being made in this mosaic, which means we know that therefore is the Dead Sea, and this is the Jordan. And Bethabara is right here where they join. And that kind of makes sense. There you go, I've got this. So according to Jewish legend, this is where Joshua led the children of Israel across the Jordan into the Promised Land. It's also apparently where Elijah ascended to heaven. I put his modern name there. In Jesus' day, the Jordan ran through, and it kind of broke into various streams, which meant it was easy to ford the Jordan at this point. And probably there's plenty of different spots for things like baptisms, which is probably why John is there. You've got loads of different spaces. You're not kind of blocking the only place you can ford, and so he's using that. And I put here, according to the book of Acts, we know there's probably at least 14 disciples who meet Jesus in this location, because Luke tells us that the only people who were when they replaced Judas. They looked for someone, and they felt it had to be someone who'd been with them from the beginning, from the days of John the Baptist. This is the context, and they put forward two people, Matthias and Justus, isn't it? And so at least those two, as well as the 12. And Luke also implies that while he may not have stuck with Jesus at that point, but he seems to imply he met Jesus there as well, because at the beginning of his gospel, having referred to John the Baptist as the beginning, he said, those who have followed from the beginning, it seemed good for me as well. And the natural reading of that is as being someone who actually also encountered Jesus. And that didn't make sense if Jesus was a nobody. But if he has had role and responsibility under John the Baptist, you can understand how people can have met him and known him at this point, even if they weren't there at every single event after that, but they've met him in this context. So this is probably it's a key kind of gathering point in that sense. As I said, it's the 15th year of Tiberius, according to Luke's Gospel, which starts in August 19th and 28 AD, so up to August the 18th, 29 AD. So at some point during that period is when probably Jesus has arrived to him. Now it doesn't say he's there on day one, and by the time Jesus comes, there's already seems to be people beginning to gather, which is why I say it's probably it's late 28, early 29 AD that Jesus comes for baptism, and is perhaps there first off with John the Baptist. So I put Messiah, I put mid with a question mark, 29 AD. Mid is the kind of latest, I'd imagine, because we've got to fit in the events before the first Passover. So we give Jesus at least half a year. But increasingly, as I think about this, I see more and more reasons to see Jesus spending longer with John. And actually, that's part of the significance of John the Baptist's ministry is not that just it was a brief thing and then Jesus starts. There was a kind of a much more of a crossover and a blending of the two, I think. So after his baptism and period in the wilderness, he stays on. He's learning with John. And that's where we read the story in John's Gospel of meeting Andrew and then Peter and then Philip, and then they go up to Galilee together, because all of those people come from Galilee. So all the various people he meets, it's probably as simple as that. If he has met Luke, but Luke doesn't come from Galilee, but he's off for a family wedding, so he's heading back to Galilee, so he invites them up with him, and those ones go with him. So we know at that time, Philip is there, Andrew's there, Peter is there. so on. So yes, there's at least 5 disciples plus 2 cousin disciples, which could be James and John. Let's keep going. So around, it may well be. Sorry, it's. I'm slightly speculating here. So when some of the figures I'm saying, they're possible, but I don't want you to say that they're definite. They're to try and understand the kind of context. It seems that even in Jesus' day, it was not uncommon for people to regather at New Year, very similar to what we do at Christmas, New Year here. Actually, when we actually notice it happens in the Gospels, that Jesus is often with his family. If you follow the flow, it's around New Year time. And so it may even be that this kind of going back for the wedding is around September, late September, when Jewish New Year is, that Jesus is kind of heading up there. But if you remember, after meeting the disciples, having had himself pointed out by John, having been in the wilderness, Jesus travels up to Cana for a wedding, where we read about his first public sign, first public miracle. So Jesus and his mother and family and disciples all visit Capernaum. So after that, it says he goes to Capernaum and it says in John's Gospel for a few days, but you've got to remember in the ancient world, a few days actually probably means longer than it means to us, because everything takes longer. It takes a few days to get there. So it doesn't, it's not like me coming here, 3.5 hours in a car. No, not 3.5, 2.5 to 3 hours in a car. So I can do here and then I can go home this evening. But actually, normally if you were doing, for most of history, if you were doing a trip like that, you would stay for a lot longer. So he's up there in Capernaum for a while, having been with John, having been significantly involved with John down here. He's gone back up to Cana. We've had the main miracle. He's travelled up with some of the Galilean disciples, Philip, Matthew. We don't know about Matthew. Philip, Andrew, Peter. Andrew and Peter have got a fishing business in Capernaum, and so Philip is across the Jordan in Bethesda. So you can kind of understand. Okay, well let's kind of go and visit. And very significantly, as we've I don't know if we've done this yet, if we've covered this, but actually John, Jesus' disciple John, seems to be his cousin. James and John seem to be Jesus' cousin. We can see that from the resurrection narratives where it describes the women who are at the cross. And we have a list that's the same in all of the Gospels, except that there are a couple of characters who get called slightly different things. So there is a character who is referred to as Salome, who is also called the mother of Jesus, the sister of Jesus' mother, i.e. Jesus' aunt. And then another one is referred to as the mother of James and John. So you put those two together, and it could be that there's multiple women, and but the most natural thing is that one is just that same person has just been described 3 different ways. So we now know 3 things about her. She's Mary's sister Salome, and she was the mother of James and John, who is one of, and which actually now suddenly makes sense of some of those things that we encounter in the gospel narrative, because suddenly there's Jesus' aunt saying, can they sit at your left and right? Because that's what aunts do. Well, she's not called the aunt, she's called the mother of James and John, but I have a friend who's he's white English, who's married a very, very Indian girl, and he always, whenever I do, it says it every time. So that's so Indian, he'll say. And he said that's actually that aunts are expected to do that. That's one of their social roles, is because it's more appropriate than for a mother, is to inveigle for their kids kind of privilege and position. So that's a kind of a common cultural thing, and suddenly it makes sense when you realise James and John are cousins. So that means you can understand this move. So they've been up there all together as a family. James and John are part of the fishing community here anyway. Peter and Andrew have quite a major cooperative, as we'll see later. They have quite a business in terms of their fishing going on up there. Philip is just across. All of these folks are there. So Jesus goes and they stay there for a while. And we don't know hugely what they're doing, but they're there. Presumably Jesus is ongoing teaching, kind of giving them thoughts, raising questions, giving them some sort of level of interesting experience. So let's keep going. And then we get to 30 AD. So we've kind of gone through 28 to 29, which has been dominated by John, coming up probably towards the end of 29, back moving to Capernaum. But Jesus goes down to Passover for Jerusalem in 30 AD, and there he deliberately causes quite a stir. So the picture we're getting is he's not yet 100% full time in terms of what he's doing in stirring things up, but he is deliberately kind of creating a certain level of experience and event for the people he's with. And so he goes into the temple. We know the story. Some of you will notice he does the same at the end. And some people say, well, why has John put this at the beginning and the synoptics at the end? I think that's missing the point. John knows the synoptic gospels. He has written something to complement them. So he is thoroughly aware that everybody knows Jesus did it at the end. The events that we read here are slightly different. In the end of Jesus' ministry, he's got masses of crowds who have cheered him coming in. They followed him into the temple. The children are dancing. He's healing the sick in the temple. He's turned over the money tables. And the priests are so angry that they make the plot. They make the deal with Judas, and they're going to murder him. And this time, he is just a hothead. And we know from the rabbinic writings that people regularly had issues with the money changers. So I'm always cautious, because you don't want to make Jesus sound not special enough, but there is also a level at which we understand him in his human kind of context, which is the money changing process that has happened at the temple has been turned into an incredibly abusive business. It's actually referred to in the rabbinic writings right the way to the period even after he's dead. It's still referred to as the bazaar of Annas, or the marketplace of Annas. Because Annas, if you remember, is not the high priest, but when Jesus is crucified, he is the kind of the behind-the-scenes high priest. The Romans stopped him being high priest because he was such a clever political manoeuvre. So he cleverly politically manoeuvred to have his 5 sons and his son-in-law to become high priest after him. And he effectively held control of the temple, and his kind of family dominated it. And he developed this system. So the system is you need to come up, but there's lots of reasons why you can't just use any old thing in the temple. So first of all, your sacrifice has to be a good one. So we have to kind of give the royal warrant kind of thing for butchers to provide animals for sacrifice. So they had already done that, but actually as Passover came, they said, but now we're going to to get your royal warrant, if you're a butcher, you have to pay. So you have to pay, which means your meat is a bit more expensive than everybody else's meat. Now it comes to the feasts, and people are coming up and they're going to buy something as they get to there. And so now they sell plots just outside. They kind of rent them to people to set up marketplace, so that as pilgrims come in, they can buy from an official butcher, if you like. But now you're paying around 8 times what you would pay for if you were just bought one from home or out of your own flock. And then when you get into the temple and you're going to make an offering, you can't use your money from anywhere in the world, because money from all over the world often has other gods on it and so on. So as you come into the court of the Gentiles, we've set up these money-changing tables. So bring your money here, and we'll give you a tiny little coin this big. We will swap. We will trade for you. We'll take your money, but we'll only give you small amounts, which have got a nominal value, which is far less than you paid for it. Which means if you want to feel like you're giving a generous gift, you have to really give a generous gift. So this whole process has been developed, and people really resent it. As a result, we read in the rabbis, the rabbinic writings, that the temple guard have to carry sticks because they have to smack people around a bit, because they were often his trouble. And it's into that context that Jesus comes, and he turns over the money tables, and not surprisingly, we hear he's put out of the temple, which doesn't mean it probably does mean they whacked him around a little bit and shoved him out, but he's just a Galilean hothead. He's no one famous. He's just another of those, whatever. He's turned up and he's done whatever, but he uses the opportunity, and then he's doing ministry outside the temple, and people are saying, and we don't know what he's doing. Presumably people may be getting healed. The way John's referred to it, as he puts it together, being baptized in the Holy Spirit with fire. Perhaps they're having a physical experience of the righteousness of God. It's not uncommon, isn't it? In people respond to the Lord, they kind of feel the thing in a way that something is going on in his ministry, and people are talking about it, and it's causing interest and a stir. And like a lot of pilgrims, Jesus seems to stay in Jerusalem at that point. He doesn't go straight back up north. Perhaps he's commuting in and out, and it's in that context that we read about Nicodemus coming to see him. I think I've got.
There's one missing there. Oh yeah, that's it. Following John's model. Next one.
Jesus travels to Canaan.
No, keep going. Yeah, forward.
Jesus creates a stir at the temple. Yeah, I'm probably taking too long on this. I'm probably doing fast. I'm probably slowing us down. So we won't talk. What we'll do is. What we're going to do with the other sessions, we're going to take each of these phases and we're going to do it in more detail. So I probably need to give the overview today. So I better I won't talk about Nicodemus right now. So Jesus, he's caused the stir at the temple. And that's where we get this reference. It's 46 years it's been standing, which allows us again to kind of date it as 30 AD. Assuming there's two takes on it. If you take when did Herod's work start, then actually it makes it 30 AD. If we say when did Herod start the work that tidied up the ruin, it would make it 38, 39. But sorry, not 38, 28, 29. I think, but fitting the bits together, it would make it kind of difficult to fit in John the Baptist ministry. So I think this therefore is 30 AD. Jesus goes outside. He's performing various miracles. At this point, so while he's still down here in the south, it's obvious that John has now left Bethbara, and we read that he's actually kind of moved further up north to here to Aeneon. So actually, while Jesus is down there, he then starts to go out to Bethbara, where John used to be, and kind of effectively reproduces. It's sort of a franchise version of what John was doing in the same location. And notice the model is the same. He's out in a secluded spot, but people are coming to him. And this is pilgrimage period, from Passover to Pentecost. There are loads of people here who are just camping out around the city, and so to hear there's something going on before on a day when there's nothing going on in the temple, you can imagine why they start to locate out. They come out to see Jesus at Bethbara. It's less than a day's walk from Jerusalem to Bethbara. And so they kind of they'll pop out to see what's going on, but it's not probably going there and back in a day is a bit tricky. But you can get out there, you can stay, you can camp out there, and you can listen to what Jesus is teaching. And he's giving the opportunity for baptism again, and he's got disciples involved with him. And he takes, so as I say, taking over that. And that message comes up to Aeneon. That Jesus is kind of basically he's taken over your old patch, John, the one who used to be with you, that guy that you put all that time into, and the things that you gave to him, and famously he does the quote, he's got to increase, and I must decrease, that he must increase. And so you almost kind of get the sense that by the Spirit, John has deliberately vacated a space to allow Jesus to step in to do something there, and because it is a great location because of particularly during the feast periods. And we hear at this point that Jesus is baptizing more people than John is. So up here, there are more people coming down here. Now that's logistically that makes sense. As I said, people have been coming in for the Passover, and then they're staying around the area. There's hundreds of thousands of people here, compared with just a few thousand around up there. So it's not surprising in one sense, but it becomes part of the dialogue and the understanding of now John is decreasing, Jesus is expanding. And just notice he's not yet started the ministry he's famous for, which is the rotating around. He's in a place where those who want to take time to come out and hear are finding him. So, John at some point, we're not sure exactly the timing, it seems to be about this period when Jesus is heading back, John gets arrested, and he's actually moved into remember I said Herod Antipas controls this area, and he controls Perea down here in the south. And he has a fortress at Machaerus, which Josephus tells us is where he puts John. So at some point, John the Baptist is arrested by Herod Antipas, because he's basically criticised Herod for marrying his brother's wife, and that's not because his brother has died. It was a kind of an affair that's kind of going on. So it's one of those messy kind of family situation, as John's criticised it. And so he gets arrested and put in Machias. And so there is a kind of a sense in which this region, is suddenly under political kind of intense focus. And Jesus actually sets out for Galilee around this point. We don't know exact timings, of course, and so on, but and actually he may set out just before John is arrested. It seems that between leaving here and getting to the north, John is arrested. Is the best way you can kind of put it. But as he sets out from Bethbara, he comes up through Samaria rather than taking the pilgrim road, which goes up the Jordan. He goes the more direct route. It's quicker, but the Jews and Samaritans don't get on. We know that story. So often people didn't. They would take the slightly longer route. He gets received at the well of Sychar, if you remember. It meets the lady there. And there's a fascinating thing, because he keeps on saying as he's heading up towards Galilee that they'll only be interested in miracles. You read it in several of the Gospels at several different locations, which doesn't mean that they got it wrong. They should have put it in one. It means it is part of the narrative as Jesus is going up. He knows as he's heading up north, this is where I'm supposed to go. But actually, people are going to love the miracles. They don't really want to hear the message, because this is one of the places. He doesn't do any miracles here. He just shares some message. He recognises in the woman that she's had 4 husbands and the man you're living with, etc. And then the people come out from the elders come out to meet him, and Jesus just teaches them, but they receive him. And that's one of the contrasts between Galilee, where people want to see miracles and get upset if he doesn't do one for them, because he doesn't do any here. As I say again, when we look at this period slightly longer, because there's lots of things I want to say right now, but I know we'll never finish this morning if we do. There's some fascinating kind of prophetic content going on at this point in this journey back, because remember, Samaria here used to be. There's an interesting Israel, which kind of covered this whole area, up in the north. They were first lost to the Assyrians, used to kind of invade, and it became Galilee of the Gentiles in Isaiah's day. So old Israel was now in the middle here in Samaria, and Judea was down in the bottom. So remember, there's Israel and Judea, which were part of the nation of full Israel, but they kind of broke into two. Galilee got taken over quite early. Samaria fell next, and eventually Judea fell. And then it all got kind of, the Jews came back to Judea, and they re-established the presence here. But Samaria was still kind of a bit out of the mix. And so when we do the longer story, when we do this in more detail, I'll highlight some of the things in prophecies in the Old Testament about what's going to happen to Samaria, because we see Jesus is part of the fulfillment of that. You see, in the fact that he goes there. Right at the beginning of his ministry, and at the end of his ministry. He's there at the beginning and the end of his ministry. So he comes up into Galilee, and it seems as they come back, it seems in some way that they half disperse the disciples. So Jesus comes to Galilee. We don't know exactly what he does, but in Galilee they refer to miracles that he's done in various places. And so it seems as he comes back to Galilee that they do go and visit certain synagogues, and it's a bit like the difference. If I came up here and spoke on a Sunday morning, not that I'm pitching or anything. If I came up to speak on a Sunday morning, and I'm not really impacting the whole town. I'm there as and it seems that because Jesus it makes reference to him being in their synagogues, but we don't know much about this. So it seems that this period, probably Peter and Andrew go back to their fishing business. It's the end of holiday season, if I can put it that way. It's the end. We've gone past Pentecost. We've got now into the summer. They kind of need to get back to their businesses and so on. But Jesus is in this region. It's in this context that Jesus comes to Nazareth, where he's grown up, and where Luke effectively chooses to kind of kick off the big Galilean push. But he's already come into Galilee. He's come in via Samaria. He's got back there. He's probably gone back for family reasons and so on. And in this context, he goes to Nazareth, as I say. and he gets rejected. And the reason he gets rejected, they're all looking forward to the miracles that he's done elsewhere. They've heard about them. They want to see them, which is what he said would be the problem when he got there. And then he outrageously talks about how, because if you think about it, Jesus is in a place where he's probably in the synagogue at which he was taught to read, put it like that, which means it's totally possible that if the guys who taught him to read aren't there, their kids are. So they're expecting special access. Yeah. So he's made a bit of a stir. We've all heard about him. The stories are coming back. He's not really launched yet, but the stories are there. Things have been spoken about. He's made an impact at because even Nicodemus has gone to have a meeting with him down there, and he's been down baptizing more people than John the Baptist. So the stories are coming back, and they know that he's done miracles in various places in Galilee. They're looking for them. And he comes in and basically says that the gospel's going out to the whole world, and that's what upsets them. At first, they're saying, "Wow, what incredible!" He preaches, and they love it. What gracious words are falling from his lip. And then he says, actually, I can't remember his exact wording, but he's basically saying that the gospel, the good news is for everybody, and they don't like that so much. And at that point, they decide they want to throw him off the cliff. Which I haven't got the image. The trouble is, in my head, I'm confusing when we do this in detail. I'll show you and so because they want to throw him off the cliff, Jesus relocates, and that makes sense, doesn't it, if you think about it? So what we actually read is that the whole family, him and his mother, they all have to leave and they go down to Capernaum. Well, that makes sense because Jesus has already got 2 cousins down there, and he's just upset his hometown because basically he's told them that they shouldn't just be looking for miracles, and they're not that special in God's plan, because actually God's interested in everybody, and that hasn't gone down so well. And at that stage, there's a little bit of a break in the action. It seems that the other disciples are kind of getting back with their regular business, but Luke has chosen this as the kick-off point because it pushes Jesus to a place which isn't technically his home, he's now living in a place that, and of course, which is right at the heart of where some of the disciples come from. So James and John, Peter and Andrew, and Philip just a few miles away, and it's not far from Cana, it's a little bit further north, which is where Matthew comes from. So he's there at the place where we're going to kind of kick off now. So building the team, I'll get into about autumn 30 AD, where we kind of seem to enter a new phase. Jesus changes his mode of operation, so he starts calling those that were with him in the south to leave their occupation and now start travelling with him. Which is, if you think about it, is how Jesus' ministry starts in the Gospel of Matthew. We actually have a kind of a summary statement in Matthew 4. He calls Andrew and Peter, and James and John, says, "Come and follow me." And then he talks about he's going around this whole region. There's news about him going all the way to Syria and so on. And then we sort of take a step back. Actually, that we read it that way because this is the way that we think about stories now. But actually, in a Jewish way of telling stories, that the end of chapter 4 is a summary that covers the next kind of 8 chapters. It is Jesus calls them and they start travelling. It's not that he calls them and they start travelling and they do all of this and then they go up the mountain and have the Sermon on the Mount. You see what I mean? The Sermon on the Mount is actually the kind of the beginnings of this ministry tour. Okay, put it that way. Again, we'll do this in more detail and you'll see how the different gospel bits fit together. But that kind of just to kind of help unravel that's not at all uncommon. You find it the same with the 72. Jesus sends out the 72. But when we look at it, you'll see that probably some of the events happening there, not all of the disciples are there because it's part of the ministry of them being spread out. Does that make sense? You find it in the Old Testament. You get a kind of a summary statement and then you get detail. If I can put it this way, that's the understanding of the difference between chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. Chapter 1, in the beginning God created and then chapter 2 we start telling the story. Does that make sense? Chapter 1, it's not that chapter 1 happened and then chapter 2 happened. It's that chapter 1 is kind of, this is where we're going, and just so you know where we got to as we get to different points, we're going for the whole of creation. Sorry, I don't want to upset anyone here, but in day 6, God's work is finished. Okay, what is day 6 in Genesis 1? It's a Friday. On day 6, on a Friday, Jesus is crucified and says it's finished. Okay. See, there's a kind of a sense in which chapter 1 is telling you the whole story of creation, and then we wind back and we start with the creation of Adam. And so it's a common Jewish way of telling a story. Sometimes they refer to it, for those who like this kind of thing, as panel writing. So you've got one panel that says this, and then another that gives more detail. So anyway, so words going out all into Syria, into the whole kind of wider region in this first tour. So that kind of summary statement it makes a big impact. So what then happens is at the beginning is both at the beginning and at the end of this period, there's Jesus goes up a mountain just outside Capernaum and calls his disciples to him. And in Matthew's Gospel, we have some of that sermon recorded at what we think of as the beginning and some at the end. In practice, I'm sure the mountain is there. Probably the process of what Jesus is teaching was continuous right the way through this period. He probably told them at the beginning and he probably told them at the end. In Luke's Gospel, it seems like it's all there at the end, but probably it's because Jesus is summarising again before he commissions them out. So the 2 sermons on the Mount are kind of collections of what Jesus taught his disciples as they went out to do missions, which is about how they should live their lives and how they should conduct themselves when they do missions work. And so we think of that as called, in Matthew's Gospel, we call the first bit the Sermon on the Mount, how should you live your life, and we call the second bit sometimes it's the kind of the chapter 10, isn't it? It's the kind of missions sermon, but they're all kind of, both of them delivered probably over the whole of the period, but there are these 2 occasions when they're in Capernaum or they go up the hill. So now we're going to finish during this period, so it doesn't all happen necessarily at the beginning, but at some point during the period, of the people who are regularly with him, he appoints 12 of them. Right from the beginning, there's always, we have to understand, there are more than just 12, but they have a certain level of administrative responsibility and so on. But more than anything, I think it's symbolic. To start a new synagogue, Jesus only needs 5. So it's not because he's not appointed 12 because he wanted to show I've got my own synagogue. He has. He's already got that at this stage. He didn't need to appoint any special leadership. I think the 12 is very clear in that he is kind of re-establishing the nation of Israel, but now in a spiritual sense. That the nation of Israel has its 12 patriarchs, and so I've appointed, very specifically, I've appointed 12 of you to have a responsibility for managing this, if I can put it that way. And I think it's interesting because it shows to me, and along with particularly with the call of Matthew, which we touched on I think before, that Jesus is deliberately thinking beyond himself. He's right from the beginning, right from the start of his ministry, he's thinking about when I'm not here, how this continues. Okay. So as I said, when he calls Matthew, I think it's very deliberately because he wants someone to record what's going on. And he makes a reference at that point to when I'm not here, right at the beginning when he calls Matthew. And when he appoints the 12, it's because he's deliberately establishing a kind of a new nation, a new spiritual nation, a spiritual version of Israel. So here are the 12. But what's interesting is there's some structure in it. I say things are interesting. Things that interest me, things that I like. in that, if you look, the 12 are always listed with a certain amount of shape to them. So that the first 3 are always the same: Simon, Andrew, and James. First 4: Simon, Andrew, James, and John. The next 4 are always the same: Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew. See, the order sometimes changed: Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas. Do you see that? So the order slightly changed, but it's the same 4 people. Does that make sense? Yeah. So straight away you can kind of see there are like 3 little groups of 4. So you just wonder, something makes you think about how does Jesus manage his team? What's the 4 for? If you know what I mean. And interestingly, remember at some point he's going to send them out in pairs. And what's interesting is that here in Matthew's Gospel, is it Matthew? Hang on, I've got it.
Yeah, that's Matthew. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Matthew. Yeah. And you've got it, I think, in Acts. Oh no, it's not. No, it's not. Acts has got the whole chain. So I've got the 4 lists, and I've shown that the 4s always appear together. But equally, I think it's Matthew, where he actually, in the Greek, he joins Simon and Andrew, and then it's kind of, there's a little semicolon there, because there's no word and. So it's Simon and Andrew, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and. So he's actually put them in pairs. Does that make sense? So just looking at it, you can see that, first of all, Jesus seems to have sub-teams, perhaps for managing things. And when he sends them out in pairs, we've actually had that probably listed in Matthew's Gospel, because otherwise there's no logic to why Matthew has chosen to speak like that. If you see what I mean, that's the only understanding. So he's got his 12. There's a bit of structure in it, and probably from the very beginning, they're probably managing groups of other people who may not be as consistent. At least 2 of them are, because they've been with Jesus the whole time, but they're probably coming in and out. Those people are being managed probably by this structure that Jesus is putting in place with his disciples. I need to keep an eye on the time. There's a clock up the back there, isn't it? What time do we?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah, okay. I was hoping we'd get to the end of the Galilee ministry, but I think we're not getting far off, so we're not doing too badly. So they're doing that kind of tour together. But they're all together. He's not yet sent the 12 out separately. So at this stage, they're all travelling together. And it's kind of, if you like, it's the experience of, now come with me and watch the miracles, and I'm now going to teach you how to do these things with me. So I mean, there comes a point where he's going to say, right now you go off and you do it yourself. And things really explode ministry-wise when he does that. But while they're in this process, doing this kind of itinerating, they head south. And as they head south, we read about them being in Nain. And we only read about this story in Luke's Gospel. And people think, why? Because if someone gets raised from the dead, it's a good story. And I suspect that when the disciples are working out which stories we tell, because we can only tell so many, and we've got to make sure we're all working from the same story, they've chosen the story which Peter, James and John are there part of, which is the raising of the little girl, Tabitha, isn't it? And so they've told that story. They've remembered that story because that was an early story as well. And Peter's right in the middle of it. He's right there with Jesus, and James and John have gone into the house with them. So they've used that story of the raising of the dead story. But perhaps Luke tells it here because Luke has joined them at this point. As I say, we don't know where Luke lives, but he very helpfully tells us about it because it actually kind of puts little markers. Jesus is beginning to head south. He's at the south of Galilee in Nain. Because the next thing we discover, and we hear about the words kind of spreading ahead of him, the events that when he raises this person, the news spreads ahead of him. This report about Jesus circulated through Judea and all of the surroundings. So he's coming down from Galilee, but the miracle here gets told about down into Judea and all the surrounding country. And John's disciples informed him about all these things. See, so John is down here in Machaerus. See that little circle down there? So he's right in the south. But as Jesus is kind of coming down, they hear, and John called 2 of his disciples, and he's going to send 2 disciples to talk to Jesus. And it makes most sense that Jesus actually, you see, has come down, is now in Jerusalem, as we're going to see, because actually it's about 6 or 7 days' journey up to get to Galilee from down here, but it's only a couple buzzing across to get to Jerusalem. So what we then discover is, if we put Jesus' story together with John's Gospel, is that Jesus is now going to Jerusalem for the feast, which is probably why he was heading south, probably why he was coming through Nain in the first place. So after these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And as he gets there, there's by the sheep pool called Bethzatha in Aramaic, which has 5 covered walkways. And so there's the man there who's waiting to be healed. And we will see when we look at this in detail. I'm getting into this habit now. Instead of telling you, I'm telling you what we are going to look at. We'll see when we look at this in detail that actually this is a New Age healing centre that the man is at. The actual description of it and everything else, it's been dug up now archaeologically. So he's not 100% good Jewish guy. He's basically hedging his bets. In that he's at a place. There's a couple of hundred of these spread throughout the Roman Empire. these healing pools with colonnades and so on. The cult of Asclepius or something it is, that's called. And there's a certain formula. We even find the formula in Jesus' mouth. It's almost like he's addressing him in that kind of context. But the key thing is Jesus, this man's been there for years and he heals him, you know. And that's just before Passover, because Jesus has gone up for the feast. He comes in towards Jerusalem. He has this encounter with the guy there. And now we get a kind of a run of dates which we can actually tie down really solidly. Because Jesus seems to stay in the south. And this is the good opportunity for John, you see, to get word to him. While he's in Jerusalem, and John is in the south, but in prison, and the word has kind of worked its way down about the raising of the widow's son from Nain. So on Saturday the 21st of April, Jesus heals the man at the pool of Bethesda, because it's a Sunday. It's not Sunday. It's a Sabbath. Sorry, it's a Sabbath, so it causes trouble, and it's a Sabbath just before Passover. And then it comes to Passover. So we have this day of preparation ends on Wednesday, the 25th of April. Presumably he has a Passover meal. We don't read about it. It's now the first day of unleavened bread. And you remember I said after the second day of unleavened bread we can start counting Sabbaths. So Sabbath, stroke the first day of unleavened bread, is Thursday, 26th of April. This is now a special Sabbath because it's the first of the ones that they count. And then the second day of unleavened bread, which is Friday, April 27th, and the wave offering is made in the temple. So Saturday, the 28th of April, is the first. So that special Sabbath is because it's Passover. So the first of the 7 Sabbaths that are counted after the wave offering is what's called the second first Sabbath. So I'm just kind of showing we can really tie this down to a solid date. And at that point, his disciples are gathering grain. So what that tells us is that incident happens down in Jerusalem, not up in Galilee. I'd never thought about it like this until I actually started to do this thing. Oh, actually, that could only happen in Jerusalem. It's too quick. They could not have got back to Galilee in time. And so Jesus seems to be around here, and it's in this context that John's disciples come. Do you remember how I said at the beginning? When you see how these bits fit together, but they were never intended to, they make you realise it's real history. Because no one kind of said, just to prove to you that this is real, while he was down there, it was convenient for John's disciples to get to him, because that would be so fake, wouldn't it? No one would write that, but it would be really contrived. But they haven't. They've just told us the story as what seemed like important to them. And as we try and piece it together, we realise this must all be happening down just outside Jerusalem. Yeah. So we're almost done, because there's the pool of Bethesda with the sick. I'm going to quickly heals on the Sabbath. Yeah. He preaches a message at Passover on the Sabbath, which you can read about. So you can put these bits in if you want to do it for yourself. It's the second first Sabbath. So you've got notes on here. What we'll do, while he's staying in the south, here you go, John the Baptist sends his delegation. It says at this time Jesus went through the grain fields, so it's while he's down here in the south. He also has a meal. This one, what I think we'll do is we'll come back at this point. Yeah. Because this is quite an interesting point, and I haven't touched on it just now. So we'll take a break now. Yeah. And we'll kind of continue the story. But does anyone want to ask any questions at this stage? My hope is that what you're getting, which you don't sometimes see, is the kind of, if you like, the slow building nature. When I say slow, I don't think it is slow. It's actually very fast. It's just in our heads we've made it unnaturally explosive. And there are some things that are almost impossible to happen that the human brain thinks are really obvious, if that makes sense. You know, if I say, we're going to organise a march through London with 1 million people. You know, the brain takes the number of 1 million, thinks, oh, yeah, okay, we're going to do a march next week of 1 million people. That logistically is a nightmare. In practice, it's impossible. You know, it's really tricky. It takes years of organising to do something like that. But it's just a number. It's just a little token in the brain. And similarly, in our brains, often what we've done with the story is we don't realise it does. It's just a very natural. It takes time for the message to get out, people to hear stuff. At this stage, Jesus isn't hitting enormous crowds. He's creating a stir, but people don't know how long this is going to last. They don't know whatever. The news is kind of spreading. It takes a week for news to travel backwards and forwards, up and down the Jordan and so on. And so Jesus is just in the process doing what he's doing. He's got disciples. He's got the space to talk to them at this point and coach them. As we're going to get through to the next half, things are going to start exploding, because it's often the way, isn't it? You know, it takes a long time while things are percolating, and then suddenly it all bursts. So let's take a break.